This happened about 2 years ago, in my second year at university. I was around 20 at the time. For context, I'm French, so if anything's weird about how I describe the university experience, that's why. At the time, I lived in a government-owned apartment building, right on the 3rd floor. My direct neighbor was my younger sister, who was studying at the same university as I. One other important thing to the story is that I'm disabled. My right leg is completely useless after an accident I had when I was 13, and I suffer from debilitating chronic pain, to such a degree that keeps me bedridden and non-verbal unless I take a twice-a-day dosage of prescribed morphine. All of that is important details, so bear with me. When I take my medication, I am able to leave my bed. On the worst days, I have to either use a wheelchair or a cane to get around. Isn't it great that we lived on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator then? On top of that, as you might guess, morphine is a very strong pain medication. It screws with your visual and hearing perception, makes you sleepy, dizzy, lessens your reflexes, numbs your nervous system, makes you paranoid, and you get the idea. At the time, I had only been taking morphine for less than 6 months. This was after 10 years of various other pain medications, and I was still dealing with those side effects in full force. Most of them are gone now. For me, that meant mainly auditory hallucinations, sleepiness, dizziness, slow reflexes, and nervous response. At that point, I had gotten used to hearing stuff that wasn't there. Mostly clapping noises, clicking, small things ultimately. I had never hallucinated human voices, though. That night, I had gone out to the center of the city to meet with some friends. It was a rare occasion for me, and I do mean rare. I didn't go out more than once every 2 months or so, for multiple reasons that my friends, bless them, understood perfectly. Being on morphine means no drinking, of course, so that's half the fun of going to the bar removed from the very start. Despite the very useful nature of the meds, I was still, and still am, in a tremendous amount of pain if I stand for more than a couple of minutes. I was sure to do a lot of that at the bar, plus walking back from the bus stop to my building, about a 5 minutes walk. But I went anyway, like I did on occasion. Now, for a few days, there had been rumors going around about a group that was going around kidnapping people from my university. From my memory, 2 girls had disappeared already, and it was suspected that a blue van was the vehicle used. Those reports were circulating on our majors group, and on the unis group as well, about the same details each time. My friends and I were skeptical, though, mostly about the blue van, because we didn't believe the van would still be running around if the information had spread enough that we were hearing about it on Facebook, you know? Not that I was thinking about any of this as I came back from the bar at around midnight. Early, I know, but I was in a lot of pain, and the bus stopped at about midnight. Missing it would mean waking up my sister so she could come pick me up at the tram station, since I was physically unable to walk the 20 minutes required. I got into the bus. Only 3 people were there, and none got out at my bus stop. Bear in mind that at this point I was in an extreme amount of pain, so much so that my vision was blurring at the edges, and I was swaying a bit from side to side, trying to minimize the weight of being on my leg. On top of that, I had just taken a fast-working morphine dose to help me get through the 5 minutes walk back to my building. Unlike my twice-a-day dose, those pills I could take to my discretion whenever I needed some quick relief. The downside of this very practical pill is that it basically knocks you out in 30 minutes. You get so sleepy you can barely keep your eyes open. Basically, you're high for about 20 minutes before passing out. I got out of the bus. On my right is a parking lot in front of a bakery with a lot of cars. It was normal because there are a lot of government-owned student flats around that block, and that's where most of them park, so I wasn't very concerned. The road I take is straight from where the bus dropped me off. For the whole walk before my building is to the right, a couple of parking spots in front of it, and a wheelchair slope going to a magnetic door. You need your magnetic student ID to open the door, then a key to the specific door to your building. As I walked by the parking lot, I could see movement in the corner of my eye. Since I was half out of it from pain and meds, I didn't turn to look at it. I could hear some noise, but I just assumed that I was hallucinating it, so I kept on walking. But then the streetlights reflect in a car window. I don't know why that specifically made me turn around. My brain was catching on to weird stuff. I briefly look over to the side, and I see an old beat-up white car, pretty long and low to the ground. In the driver's seat was an Algerian man, in his mid-50s perhaps. The neighborhood being half students, half France-born Algerian, the thing that gives me pause is more the fact that there's someone awake in the front seat of a car at 1 in the morning. Again, I was out of it, so I didn't question it. I didn't even stop walking at this point. My only thought was, put one foot in front of the other. You're almost there and almost done with the pain. Literally all my attention and focus was putting one foot after the other, because I was in so much pain. I walked past the small roundabout to my left, still going straight, when I heard a car starting up. I don't know why that was the thing that slapped me in the face, but suddenly I became very worried. My heart was beating fast, probably half of the meds and half from fear. But also I was well aware the morphine tends to make me paranoid. I tried to calm myself down. I saw the headlights coming from behind me, drawing a long shadow right in front of me. In a second I ran through the calculations. I'm still about 300 meters, about 1,000 feet from my building. Then I need to get my ID out and open the door. A slow, automatic magnetic door. I can't run, obviously. I can barely even walk. I'm up to my head in morphine. It's the middle of the night. I'm alone with no residential building close enough to hear a scream. And that's when I started to panic. It appears I was right to do so. The car catches up to me, slows down to my walking speed. I noticed that the man wasn't alone in the car anymore. Someone was in the passenger seat, and there was movement in the back. I didn't turn my head because I tried to pretend I didn't notice them slowing down. I had my earphones in with no music, as I didn't turn it back on after the bus ride. I kept on walking, hoping with everything I had they would leave me alone. I was trying to walk faster, but I was in so much pain that tears started falling from my face. I could hear their calling for my attention, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Finally, I see the lane going up to my building. I take my backpack off and I shove my hand down the front pocket, fumbling because my nervous response is shit thanks to the meds. I couldn't feel my fingers, and I was shaking like crazy. I couldn't find my ID anywhere. At that point, I was close to a panic attack. My heart was beating too fast, and I felt close to fainting from the combined pain and terror. I turned to face the wheelchair slope when I see from the corner of my eye the car stopping abruptly right next to the slope, and the car door slamming open. I don't know how I did it. I was so close to fainting, but I managed to run the last 10 feet to the door and slap my ID on the reader, the whole time yelling at the door to open faster. I could hear people starting to run behind me. The door finally opened enough for me to slip in, and I slammed it shut behind me. I heard the men run into the door with a loud noise, and them cursing, then yelling things to me. I didn't stick around to hear what they had to say. I fumbled with my keys to the point of almost dropping them before opening the door to my flat complex. I got inside on shaky legs, and as soon as the door closed behind me, I dropped to the floor and had the worst panic attack of my life. When I managed to put myself back together and painstakingly climb the 3 flights of stairs, I crawled into my sister's flat. We left our doors open for each other for precisely these circumstances. I woke her up, telling her the whole story. She told me later I was deathly pale, so much that I scared her enough that she offered for me to share her bed that night. I was too fucked up to refuse. The worst part is, this isn't even the end of the story. My sister went out to bars a lot more than I did. She was able-bodied and drop-dead gorgeous. About 3 weeks later, she called me up in the middle of the night. She was coming back from a bar. She had seen that exact car I described in the parking lot, stationed at the bus stop. She didn't stop to see if there was anyone inside. She reacted right away and sprinted to our building. Of course, she was a lot faster than my drug-disabled ass, so she made it to the door where I was waiting for her, having it opened from the inside, just as the car stopped in the lane. After that, we left a note in our flat complex's door to explain everything to other people. We posted about it on every university group we knew of, and even contacted the police. They helpfully told us they could do nothing without catching them in the act, but that they'd probably send someone to patrol. It matched the reports they had gotten that had sparked the whole blue van rumors in the first place. In the following year it took to finish my degree, neither me or my sister saw those men or their car again. We still hear from people, though, that same kind of story being shared from all other parts of the city. As far as we can tell, they're still active 2 years later. I'm still fucked up about it. This happened about a year ago. There were so many terrible factors working against me that night. I'm astounded I got away unscathed, at least physically. This all begins when I'm at my friend's apartment, who lives in a really rough part of town. In a series of poor decisions, that night I decide to get belligerently drunk and take a few pills of God knows what. I know. Safe to say, after a solid night of partying, around 4 a.m. I was not in the right state of mind. My drug-addled brain decides that instead of staying the night at my friend's apartment, like I normally would, I wanted to Uber back to my own place. My friend's apartment had 2 separate entrances and exits to the building, one in the back unlit parking lot of the building, and one facing into the street. They had 2 sets of keys for each door, and I only had keys to the one in the back of the apartment. Since my Uber would obviously arrive at the street, and the door in front of the building locks itself behind you, I exited this way when the driver was soon to arrive. Looking back, standing outside that apartment, I realized I looked like the easiest target on the planet. I'm a very small, petite female, in my early 20s, and I could hardly stand upright. I'm using a street lamp to prop myself up, and not doing a very good job about it either. The light was basically a beacon for any nearby predators saying, "Come and get me." I'm not paying attention to my surroundings at all in this state, despite the fact that there was literally a bullet hole in the front door I just came out of. Not good. I remember checking to see what car I was getting picked up in, and was only able to pick out the fact that it was a black sedan. Soon after stepping outside, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. They started rolling down the window, so I stepped forward. Before this man even spoke, though, I could immediately feel that something was wrong. He had an expression like he was tearing me apart with just his eyes. After seeing that look, it gave me a new meaning to the word predator to describe a criminal, because I then knew what it felt like to be the prey. He basically barked at me, "Hey, I'm your Uber driver." This was the second red flag that somehow made its way through my brain. Normally, Uber drivers just roll down the window and say, "Hey, is that you?" or some version of that, but always including your name. I think I just stared at him for a moment, my brain slowly piecing together the situation I was potentially in. I asked him, "Hey, what's my name?" He immediately got enraged and started screaming about how he didn't have time for this. Just get in the fucking car. I don't think I've ever sobered up so fast in my life. I was completely panicking. Obviously, this was not my Uber. And quickly checking the license plate, I immediately noticed that it was not a match. Meanwhile, this guy was still screaming at me, and I had absolutely no idea what to do. If I bolted in either direction, this guy could easily outrun me or even have a weapon. I was also pretty sure that if he was trying to nab a random girl off the street, he must have a weapon of some sort. I can't run back into the apartment door right behind me since it locked, and I don't have the keys nor the time to unlock it if I did. Running towards the back door would do nothing as well. He was idling right by the mouth of the driveway towards the back parking lot. Again, I wouldn't have time to find the keys and get in. If I screamed, well, I'm not exactly in the type of neighborhood where someone would try to be a vigilante. I can still hear the music radiating from my friend's third-floor apartment. I knew they wouldn't be able to hear me. It was 4 a.m., and absolutely no one was around. People talk a lot in this sub how they either sprint into action or freeze, but I felt incapable of doing either. It was the worst feeling I've ever felt in my life. Everything in me wanted to run, but I felt that if I did, it would be the end of me. But if I kept standing there, staring at Chalk and the screaming man, the result would likely be the same. From when he started screaming at me to this point, I'm guessing about only 20 seconds had passed by. Just as he was looking like he was ready to jump out of the car and make his way towards me, another black sedan pulled up right behind him. Checking the license plate as quickly as I could, I realized it was my actual Uber driver and made a full sprint to the car. I threw myself in, screaming at my real Uber driver, "What's my name?" The poor dude looked terrified, but he responded with my real name quickly. I replied, "Get me the fuck out of here. That man is trying to kidnap me." If I was in the Uber driver's position, I think I would be too shocked to react as quickly as he did, but my dude flew out of there. He offered to call the cops for me even, which I declined and now regret. He even walked me to my front door of my apartment, ensuring I got inside safely. And truly an incredible human being. You can rest easy knowing he got the fattest tip my college student bank account would allow for, although he deserved much, much more. So, to the man who ruined my sense of security and caused countless anxiety attacks when out in public for months, let's not meet. I go for a short run every night right after sundown, usually when it's finally cool out. I always take the same route, a loop through a quiet and sparsely populated neighborhood, and I now realize how easy of a target that made me. A short section of the route passes an unlit park. A couple of weeks ago, I'd seen a guy hanging out behind a truck that was parked next to the entrance. It was so unusual to see someone else up there that I decided to be extra cautious, turn around, and head back home. I didn't get close enough to get a good look at his face. A few days later, I saw what looked to be the same guy by the park again. I figured I was probably just being paranoid, but I decided to turn around again just in case. I hadn't noticed any activity by the park in the last several days, so I resumed my normal route and didn't even think about the man I'd seen up there. And then last night, as I was passing by the park, I suddenly had an inexplicable feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't spot anyone nearby, but the park extends into pitch black darkness, so someone could easily hide there unseen. I decided to just keep running, looking confident and try to hurry past the park as quickly as I could. Suddenly I smelled a very strong wave of cologne in the air. That immediately put me on edge. I'm pretty damn grateful he was wearing it, so it tipped me off. After I smelled it, I had no doubt in my mind that there was somebody nearby, but still I didn't see any movements in front or on either side of me. I was afraid to turn around. Immediately past the park, there's a bend in the road. There's a house on the corner as you turn down the road. The house has a lot of tall bushes in the front yard. Normally I would run past these without even thinking, but since my gut instinct was blaring like a siren, I moved to the middle of the street as I rounded the corner. I shot a glance behind me to see if anyone had actually been nearby. As I looked, I saw a man slowly walking through the front yard of the house on the corner, looking right at me. He paused and crouched behind the bushes, as if he was trying to remain hidden. I could see his jeans and a pair of black and white sneakers, but little else. His slow footsteps were so creepy that I can't get the image out of my mind, as if he was trying to be quiet as he could, like a cat stalking its prey. If I hadn't made the split decision to run in the middle of the street and away from the yard, I would have been right within grabbing distance. I don't know how I acted so quickly, probably thanks to adrenaline. I turned on the flashlight on my phone. I aimed it right at the bushes, hoping it'd startle him or blind him long enough for me to get some distance in between us, and started sprinting at full speed down the road. It was probably the fastest I've ever run in my life. At the end of each block, I glanced behind me to check if the man was still there. Fortunately, I had lost sight of him. If he'd decided to sprint after me, I'm not sure what I would have done. From what I could make out, he was at least a foot taller than me. By the time I got home, the adrenaline had finally dissipated, and I was shaking with fear. I couldn't sleep at all last night. What scared me the most about this whole thing is that I'm 99% sure this was the same guy I'd seen hanging out in front of the park recently. Now I can't shake the idea that he'd been watching me, calculating the right timing to try and sneak up behind me. He knew that I always ran past there around the same time. The thought that he was probably watching me from the darkness in the park last night, before quietly moving out of it and starting to follow me, makes me sick. Needless to say, I won't be running past that park at night anymore. The terror I felt when I turned around and saw the man's shoes slowly moving behind the bushes, and his head facing me, it's like nothing else I've ever felt before. I live in a small town, the kind where almost everyone knows each other. It also creeps me out to think that this might have been someone I've seen around town in the past. And part of me wishes I could have gotten a better look at his face for the report. Another part is glad I didn't. Over the years, as a woman who has declined every proposal of marriage or conventional living arrangement, largely moving through life as a single female, I've gathered more tales of dangerous chance encounters than I can even rattle off in a whole day. Stalkings, a murderer that's never been apprehended, death threats, actual physical assaults, and I'm not especially defiant of common sense or rules to live by, i.e. I don't walk home after dark. I never open the door to strangers. I'm not chatty or inclined to give people I meet my phone number, even if they seem stable. Really, I'm just socially lazy. But my earliest memory of contact with a predator predates the invention of the internet, when I was just a child living with my also very single mother. We had just moved into a large white American colonial-style home across the street from a daycare center. It was the nicest home we had lived in so far, which says a lot because my mother was forever struggling to keep me clothed and fed, while my father pursued his dreams of being an artist. He could afford to pay little in child support, but he did pay without fail every month, and ultimately became a very successful painter and left me a very impressive legacy. I'm very proud to be his daughter. I was excited because I had the entire downstairs level to serve as my own personal play palace, away from my chronically high-strung mother, and she was relieved to be directly across the street from reliable childcare. Perhaps the low rent had something to do with the fact that our neighbors to the right were Moonies, essentially members of a worldwide cult referred to as the Unification Movement. A group of them lived in an upscale home a stone's throw away, with shuttered windows that never opened, and we almost never laid eyes on them. Never during the daytime. Never ever. And to the left was Ron. Ron was a middle-aged man, probably in his 40s, a little more than a decade older than my mother. I was 7 at the time and pretty observant and stoic for a child, so it didn't escape my notice that Ron was very eccentric. Peculiar. Always wound up and kind of dopey at the same time. He had wild dark hair that stuck up and kind of fanned out on the sides but was thinning on top, where he insisted on conspicuously combing in such a manner as to hide his visible scalp. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his eyes and somehow lent him an air of goofy harmlessness, like the fourth missing stooge. When we first met Ron, who appeared in our front yard one afternoon, after she collected me from daycare, my mother's weirdo meter went off right away. He seemed overeager to be living next to a financially strapped single mother and her strange daughter. My mother was beautiful by any standards, however. Tall, willowy, with dark blonde hair that ended at her waist, perpetually the perfect shade of tan thanks to her Native American grandparents that raised her most of her formative years. Really a striking and unusually beautiful woman, but troubled. Very troubled. She was troubled for a lot of cultural reasons, which left her socially awkward and gun-shy, also sympathetic to other socially challenged individuals, so she decided to give Ron the benefit of the doubt. I thought, and later she would say she thought as well, that Ron just developed a very big crush, fast and understandably. It started with a locket a locket which had a picture of me inside of it. That was the very first gift he surprised her with, calling up to the house standing outside our fence. It looked like an antique to us, which Ron confirmed he came across at work, as he was an antiques dealer. My mother was deeply disturbed by the photo of me, which was obviously taken unbeknownst to anyone while I was playing in the yard. Back then, everything was done with 35mm film. No one had cell phones or home printers, even disposable cameras. We had Polaroid and 35mm, and this was 35mm, meaning there were likely other photos of me which had been developed sitting in his house. My mother tried to refuse the gift, explaining that she was not by any means okay with anyone taking photos of her daughter without her consent. Ron appeared to be inconsolably apologetic, so she accepted, reluctantly thanked him, and we both returned inside. The next gift was a large stereo system. Stereo systems were not cheap in those days, and this was one of the more expensive models. Ron, who always looked especially sweaty and sickly in the Texas heat, said he had received it from a pawn shop owner he was friendly with. He had a home stereo, though, as well as a system at the antique shop, so he couldn't benefit from it. He didn't want to go through the trouble of selling it, and wouldn't want it to go to waste when it could go to us, since he was certain we would not have a system of our own. He was right. We just had a little boom box. Well, I had one. My mother had books and her writing, and eschewed other forms of entertainment as brain-rotting. My mother refused the extravagant gift, but Ron begged her to take it for my sake. Finally, she relented, incredibly uncomfortable. She said she could at least listen to Tina Turner, of whom she was quite the fan. However, she took Ron's suggestion and set the system up in my den downstairs. The third gift was a camera, an obviously expensive professional camera, which he again claimed he had received from a friend who was in some sort of retail business. These items didn't look used in any way, and my mother really wanted the attention to stop at this point. She flatly refused the gift and drew her line in the sand. No more gifts. None. Period. She began to dread coming home from work, and I was no longer allowed to play in the yard. Despite the absence of gifts, Ron would still appear at the fence or catch my attention from the bottom window. I would instinctively go get my mother, who would come down and firmly but politely tell him it was not a good time for visiting or neighborly chit-chat. My mother and father had just worked out a new visitation schedule, and I was to begin spending Saturday nights at his house. Up to that point, I had spent Friday nights there, but it was all 6 of one, half a dozen of the other as far as she was concerned, so Saturday it was. That first Saturday went pretty smoothly, until the following morning, when my father returned me to my mother's house, and we learned that someone had broken into the home, taken nothing, gone nowhere except the downstairs. My mother had heard them come in, and quietly locked the door at the top of the stairs. It was a weird feature we were suddenly grateful for. She proceeded to hide from the intruder until he left some minutes later. I had just fortunately been away at the time, because it was quite typical of me to stay up late on a Saturday night, listening to the stereo since there was no school or work the next day. The police told her she needed a dog of any size, and to go get herself a gun. She took off work the next day, and I stayed another night with my father while she went shopping for a shotgun. At some point, while talking to my father about the incident, the matter of neighbors came up, and Ron entered the conversation. When my father learned about all the attention Ron had fixed on my mother, he was naturally quite alarmed, especially for me, who he was worried might get caught in the crosshairs. My dad was kind of a vaguely emotionally unavailable man, but he was not an absentee father by any means, and I knew beneath his somewhat distant, placid surface that he loved me very greatly. My mother would later tell me about his duality, unable to pass up taking in a stray dog or cat, but he would come home from bars covered in other people's blood. He had been a boxer for many years in the service, and he was unafraid of even people he probably should have avoided. Something of a wild card. You never knew what he would do when push came to shove. Some time went by, not a great deal, a week or two. I began to notice Ron walking by my school often when we were at lunch recess. He'd stop by and say hi to me, which no one seemed to notice. I didn't mention it to my parents because I really didn't understand the concept of child predators at that age, and because Ron never engaged me beyond saying hello or waving as he walked along the fence. It never occurred to me that anything untoward was happening. Finally, one day, he stopped the fence and said, "Hey, I'm gonna get some ice cream. It's so hot out, you know? Aren't you hot?" It was Houston, Texas. Even as a child born and raised, I remember sweating in my shoes and speculating about the blistering temperature with friends. Is it 120 degrees? 200 degrees? We didn't know, but we thought it was close and had overheard news reports of elderly people expiring from heat stroke. My father always spoke of melting into a puddle on the sidewalk, and it conjured images of grandmothers liquefying like candles into unidentifiable pools of wax on the concrete. So, hell yes, I was fucking hot. I nodded. "I really wish I could take you to get some ice cream with me," he said, sticking his fingers to the high chain-link fence. "Hey!" he exclaimed as though he was suddenly brained with a brilliant idea. "You want to come with me to go get some ice cream?" There was a defining moment in my child's brain when it became something other than simply the mind of a child. I somehow understood then that Ron was not just Crazy Ron, as my parents had called him. He was sinister. His intentions were darker than a child could fathom, but I seemed to snap to that awareness too. Up to that point, we had been warned what adults who sought to hurt children would say to lure us away from safety. It was all over television commercials, billboards, pamphlets. Police and guest speakers visiting our school would recite the script lines meant to tempt us with promises of pixie sticks and bubblegum. But they never told us what happened after that, what they would actually do after dropping the bait. And I didn't need to know. An uneasy feeling crept over me, and I backed as quickly as I could away from the fence, telling him that I needed to go. Recess was almost over. About an hour later, I was called into the principal's office. I was terrified. I had never been called down to the office before. I was still a pretty well-behaved kid at this stage in my life. But once I walked in, I saw both my parents and my stomach dropped. My mother was visibly shaken, and my father was pacing back and forth. I had only seen my father angry one time that I could recall, and yet I knew in my gut that he was seething in anger in that moment. I knew I was really fucked if my mother and father had to leave their respective jobs to come deal with something I had done. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong, though. I quickly learned, though, that Ron had gone into the office, stating that he was my father. He was coming to pick me up, and we would be moving to another state, so I wouldn't be returning. Luckily, my father was a very involved parent, and he was also friends with the artist boyfriend of my teacher at the time. We often ran into them at the art supply store, and Miss Curry knew extremely well what my real father looked like. When she received word that my father was there to whisk me away for good, she went straight to the office to learn more. The man standing before her was clearly not my father, and the staff's internal alarms were rung. The police had already taken Ron, and I'm not really sure what happened next. I do know at some point in the days that followed, Ron returned home briefly, long enough for my father to find him. Unfortunately, my father is no longer living, and he can't fill in the blanks at this part of the story, but I do remember he came straight to the house looking flustered, holding one hand in another and wincing. He told us that Ron wouldn't be living next door any longer, and if we ever saw a trace of him again, that my father would kill him with his bare hands. He took me to his house for several days, and when I returned home, Ron was gone. Police continued to move in and out of his house for the rest of the week. There were no stalking laws at the time in Texas, and even kidnapping was a fairly new concept to law enforcement, with limited protocols in place. It was the 80s, but what I have been able to piece together is that eventually, the police were able to tie Ron to the break-in at my mother's house, where he had likely gone, clumsily planning to abduct me. Whatever they found in his house was enough to keep him behind bars. We learned that Ron had been living with his mother, Norman Bates style, his entire life, until she died not long before, leaving him the house next to us and the antique shop. He was not a well-balanced adult, and was likely psychosexually stunted for reasons I can never really know. The part that really makes me uneasy here is Ron's plan to move with me in tow. I couldn't imagine he was actually planning to abandon the home he owned. I don't know if he was simply being compulsive, thinking he would work out the kinks after he got me in his clutches, or if he had some terrible plan to dispose of me and the evidence before I was officially declared missing. My mother purchased a German Shepherd, violating the terms of her lease, and we had to move to a garage apartment across town, so we never saw Ron again. Hopefully no one did outside of fellow prisoners, but I suspect he was eventually released back into society again at some point. Who knows? I doubt he's even still alive in 2020. I suppose the most frightening aspect of the whole ordeal is not that he existed in the first place, but that my mother was never the target, only an obstacle, and all the flattery and attempts to infiltrate her life were simply the acts of a man trying to get around her to her child.